And here we are. Well, folks, welcome to History Matters. And so does coffee. I do not actually have coffee. So History Matters, I will at the end have something. Oh, thank you. What does it say? Life,
This
liberty.
is from our mug swap. Life, liberty, happiness, coffee.
That is us. Life, liberty, happiness, coffee. And in the absence of coffee, a hotel glass of water. Um, at any rate, welcome. Um, Today we're going to talk about kings. Which hardly is a surprise. As the events in the last few days were unwinding, there were people on social media that were like, I wonder what we're going to talk about on Friday on History Matters. Like, no idea. But before we have that conversation, I turn to my amazing partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. I am here each week with Joanne. And the way that this works, if you're new to us, we have a robust chat going on and that can continue. But as Joanne talks about today's topic, if you have questions, we would love for you to put those in the Q&A. I will come back in about a half an hour and look for those, and then we'll have a discussion.
Excellent. And as we do always say at the beginning of our uh, conversations here. If you are here for the first time, please go into chat and tell folks that you're here for the first time. This an amazing community. I forget within a nanosecond. Maybe this is our 254th episode. And I don't have anything open, so I can't. Oh, 256. Thank you very much. It is our 256th episode. The community of people here is a true community. So if you go into chat and you say that this is your first or one of your first times here, you will get a robust welcome from the History Matters community. 256 times. Okay, so here we are. Here we are at a moment where, in a way that I would not have imagined, we're going to be talking about kings. And the reason we're talking about this right now, there are many reasons one could talk about it, and I might be talking about it again. But at the moment, it's because President Trump I don't have the actual tweet in front of me. And I should say, folks, for those of you who are here every week, I am at the moment in Miami, Florida, in a hotel room. So whatever echo or weirdness is going on right now, that's why. But at any rate, and so I don't have all my normal trappings and things that I can look things up on. But as probably coming pretty close to what was said on, I guess, Twitter, Truth Social, I don't even know which. President Trump sent out a post talking about how the congestion pricing of New York was going to go down. And the closing line, I believe this is a direct quote, is long live the king. Is that it? Someone's going to have to say that, confirm that. Yeah. So someone's going to have to, was it long live the king? I think that was it. At any rate, he called himself a king, and then images began to appear. I believe one from him, like a fake Time magazine cover with him with a crown on his head. Okay. So needless to say, as an American, as a historian, and as an early American historian, um, I had a strong response to this. And I know many of you, whether you're any of those things, probably had a strong response as well. And one of the interesting things that I've been reflecting on since then, and that has been revealing itself in bits and pieces. And if I had a lot of time and better resources in front of me, I would have done more of this research. I encourage you, actually, any of you watching, to do this on your own. In the little time that I had to prepare for our conversation, what I saw was there was I don't even know where the meeting was, the town meeting was, where people were yelling, I think to a member of Congress that they don't want a king. They don't believe in kings. There's a lot of anti-king yelling, not just fine philosophical discussion going on right now, but yelling about the fact that we don't want a king. Now, it makes one think that Americans generally, and it's probably beneath the surface simmering and people aren't touching on it very often, have a pretty strong degree of anti-kingness, if you think about it, right? That's if you know nothing about American history, you know there was a revolution and you know it was against a king, right? That's kind of the bare basics, right? That's America was a revolution against a king. King George, if you have extra bonus information, but regardless, this country was founded by revolting against a king who was considered, to use words from the time, a brute, a tyrant, someone who was crushing his people and needed to be, well, declared independence from would be the way of putting it, overridden, thrown aside. We needed independence. That's obviously the origin of our country. But the larger point here, and one that I'm watching unfold, and I don't know when later today I will have time to do this, but you can be sure I will be, around the country and in different people online and on TV programs and wherever, saying we don't want a king. I don't want a king. Like, how dare they? How dare he? This is wrong. Now, there've been a lot of things that I would apply that amount of passion to happening in recent times. But the passion happening as of just the last few days is fascinating to me because I really do think there is a strong degree of anti-kingness that lies beneath the surface of many American citizens, and it has been provoked now. Now, it makes me think about some of the things that, for example, Federalist politicians would say at the end of the 18th century, between, say, I don't know, 1793 and the election of 1800, and when really there was a lot of discussion, some of it specific, some of it more general, that was essentially about how democratic this new country was going to be. How much power should the people have? And there's a quote, and I don't have it in front of me. I know I've cited it before. For all I know, I cited it last week. When you do 256 episodes, at some way or another, you end up repeating yourself. So I apologize here and for all time that I'm repeating some things. But hey, I mean, history is long, but it's also short, at least United States history. At any rate, this was someone speaking in like 1798 or 1799, and he was talking about when you go out in front of the public and you make any kind of speech in front of the people, never, ever, ever use the word aristocrat. Because if you do, you're done. No one will hear anything that you say after that point because Americans really don't like the idea of aristocrats at this moment that we're in when we're thinking about democracy. All they need to do is hear a whisper of aristocrat and it triggers the anti-aristocrat, down with aristocrats kind of feeling of Americans. And I'm getting the same vibe from our current moment, where long live the king, Donald Trump with a crown on his head. And now there's all of this rhetoric of people saying, curses, we don't need a king. And on the one hand, I am always happy to see people feeling passionate about what is going on in front of them, right? In this way, in which they're thinking about it, they're responding to it, they're thinking about the government, they're thinking about what American government should be. So the America's instinctive anti-kingness is going to be a thing to watch in coming days. I mean, it is, well, I don't want to say inevitable because I believe in, as anyone here knows, contingency. Historians believe in contingency. History is contingency. When you're living a life and looking forward in time, you don't absolutely know what's going to happen. Everything is contingent. We live in a time of extreme contingency. All of that said, part of what we have just seen, Long Live the King, is a sign that someone who really wants to be a king or feels that they are a king is going to push too far. And in this case, really quickly too. And it's not going to be the last time that there's pushing that is going to go too far. This is just an interesting kind of a push. At this moment, amidst all of these executive orders and firings and the everything that's going on around us, I don't even have to list it. In this moment, to use that word, interesting moment, and it does make you think about the fact that even now it is possible to push too far. And it would be fascinating. Historian brain is talking, right? American citizen brain is with the rest of you feeling kind of surreal. Like, I don't know where I am as American citizen brain. Historian brain is thinking, wouldn't it be fascinating if declaring himself a king is like the thing that set off a response, a powerful response? If that's the thing, if plugging into American anti-kingness had that kind of an impact? I can't predict that. I don't know that. But as a historian, thinking about American history and thinking about American culture and thinking about what we do, generally speaking, as Americans retain of where we came from and what we stand for, that's a pretty strong thread. Now, I did go this morning, not surprisingly, to find Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, 1776. And here's the quandary that the United States was in at the time. You already, by that point, had Lexington and Concord. Americans were stunned that British soldiers had fired on British colonists. The news of that spread and was equivalent to many people. I have at points in the past, and again, I'm in the hotel room, so I can't call them up. But at some point in the past, I found comments from people along the lines of written years and years and years later. I remember where I was when I heard the news of what had happened at Lexington and Concord. That's what we do when we hear or experience a crisis, some kind of shock, right? I remember where I was. I remember where I was when I heard about what was happening on 9/11. I remember where I was when the Challenger exploded. Like I always remember where I was when Roe v. Wade was overturned because I was with you guys. But regardless of that, we remember at moments of intense shock. We tend to remember precisely where we were because of the inherent emotional shock, trauma of hearing something that is that shocking. And at some point in the distant past, what I found were one or two quotes from colonists years later, now Americans, saying, I remember exactly where I was when I heard that British soldiers had fired on British colonists. That's the degree to which what was happening at the time, and particularly that, like our soldiers killing us, the shock of that. So that's earlier, right? 1776 comes around, and by this point, we're moving towards declaring independence. We haven't done that yet. And that's when Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. His goal in writing Common Sense, and the title kind of right says it all. He's essentially in one way or another trying to argue to Americans it is common sense to overthrow the king. It is common sense to declare independence. It is common sense just to have our own government. But to do that, he has to do something that's difficult and that takes time. And that is convince Americans, and they're Americans in the sense that they're in North America, but they're British. And they, generally speaking, until British soldiers were firing on British colonists, felt true to their king, had love for their king and appreciation of their king. The king was kind of the center of the empire. The depth of feeling that colonists had towards their king, their father, was intense. What Paine felt he needed to do was break that. He needed to get Americans to get beyond the idea that the king was the father. He wanted Americans to think about what a king was, what a king actually was, what this king in particular, King George III, what he was doing and who he was. Because the only way Americans were going to get beyond the moment that they were in would be if they were willing to take two steps back and look at the king for what he was. It was a hard thing to do. It was an emotional thing to do. You look at someone like John Adams, who is, in some ways you could say the father of independence. He's the guy leading the way, right? Wanting the Declaration of Independence and declaring of independence. And you can see John Adams slowly finding his way to the point where he can turn his back on the king. Even he is not like, you know what? I hate that king. Let's have a revolution. That's not the mode. That's not the feeling of that time. So Paine steps in. I'm going to write Common Sense. I'm going to write it in basic English. I'm not going to throw a lot of Latin phrases around, which is what a lot of pamphlets at the time would have done. He says, no, I'm going to write a pamphlet. It will be plain common sense. And it will be talking about what is a king? What is our king? What is a king? What should we be thinking about kings? And his aim is to get Americans to be able to step away from unthinking love of the king and to really evaluate the situation that they're in. an intense thing to attempt, a difficult thing to attempt. And in a sense, he accomplished his purpose. Again, I don't have access to ways in which to research, but I'm sure you will find them very, very easily if you Google them. There are all kinds of quotes. Actually, go to Founders Online through the National Archives and look up quotes, roughly around the time that Common Sense comes out and put in Common Sense or put up, search on Common Sense or Thomas Paine, and you will see people, I think it's Adams, where someone at the time says, 2 days ago, no one was talking about like the king and overthrowing the king in quite this way. And now, like common sense, that's all anyone talks about. They talk about it all the time. It's everywhere. So it had a big impact. It did what he wanted, and it continues in a way because it's a thing that, again, Americans generally being not so good about knowing their history, a lot of people do have a sense that the pamphlet Common Sense by Thomas Paine existed. What I want to do is read you just a bit or two from Common Sense, just to give you the flavor of what it is that Paine was doing, how radical it is that he was doing. And again, as I read this, before I plunge into it, think about the degree to which the king, right? This is the King of England. This is someone who, had a divine link, right? This is someone who you don't at the King of England, right? He is the center of the political, I suppose, and cultural and economic universe if you're a British subject at that moment. So this is a big deal. And here's Paine saying, you know what? I'm going to change things. So, and I posted this all over social media yesterday because it's so punchy, because it's Thomas Paine, but I want to read this paragraph. I'm going to read actually two paragraphs, but this is the first one. But where, say some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Great Britain. Now that's pretty dramatic language there, guys. The royal brute of Great Britain. If you were at that period and you're reading this pamphlet, you would have gone, oh, whoa, like that's kind of shocking language. Yet that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America, the law is king. For as in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. But lest any ill use should afterwise arise, let the crown, at the conclusion of the ceremony that he's describing here, be demolished and scattered among the people whose right it is. Thomas Paine has a way with a pen, right? He's saying the royal brood of Great Britain. Like, who is he? Right? We don't owe him the kind of allegiance that we assume. Law is our king. And even at the end, our right. We have rights. That's what's important at this moment. That's what we should be thinking about. That's what should be leading the way, not the King of England. And this is, again, where I started out, sort of America's inherent anti-king sentiment. You can feel it really throughout this passage. I want to read another. Now, that paragraph is pretty well known. I want to read another paragraph because it captures the intensity and the emotion of this moment of throwing off the king, of declaring oneself independent of a king, what a big deal it was at the time, but also how meaningful that was. The depth of that, how do I want to put it? The sort of emotional and philosophical and personal depth of that and what it meant. And here's Paine, and he's writing about the moment, the fact that at this moment, these American colonists need to think about where they are and what they stand before and what they are doing and why they are doing it and the stakes. So he's talking about the American cause. He's talking about declaring independence from the king. Okay, so this is Paine. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a county, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now. Now is the seed time of continental union, faith, and honor. The least fracture now will be like a name engraved with the point of a pin on the tender rind of a young oak. The wound would enlarge with the tree, and posterity read it in full-grown characters. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. And this is a concern not just of the moment, but for the sake of posterity. Paine is amazing at doing what he does. And throwing off a king, declaring independence from a king, required all that skill, all that passion. And I think, and I'm watching to see what's going to happen. I'm going to find a way, I suppose, to contribute to some of what we're seeing. And by that I mean remind people of our birth in anti-kingness. Remind people what a king is. Remind people what it means if someone who leads this country declares himself a king, what it is asserting and what it is denying. And part of what it is denying is us. The government's ours. It's ours. Government employees, government, federal employees, they owe their power to us. We are the power at the heart of the United States government. We grant power, and we have the power to take it away. That's the heart of our system of government. And I believe I have an inherent faith that Americans at some level understand that, don't always think about it, but understand it. And the word king is a triggering word in that sense. It really is. And we're watching it now. There are, this is the understatement of the year. There are many things that have happened in the last month that could have and should have incited more passion than they have. The word king getting the amount of attention it gets, and there have been people that have been like, it's a distraction. It's to get us to not pay attention to all of the other things that are happening that are off the charts. Yes, there are a lot of things that are happening that are off the charts, but I don't think, well, let me put it this way. We will discover if the use of the word king is a distraction. If it's meant to be, it might be a really poor choice, because I really do think right now, it's a triggering word in a way that is fascinating to see, and we will see what happens. The combination of that word with some of what is unfolding now politically might have some real power to it. It really might. And I think that's important. And I think that at the same time that we should not focus all of our attention on a claim of being a king, we should not ignore that. We should be thinking about that. We should be talking about that, because the implications of that, you don't have to think very hard to get to the implications of what that means. And there's a real power to that. So not only did I want to talk about this because it's kind of a unbelievable moment that we need to be having this conversation right now, but because this is a moment with a lot of power in it in many ways, and who knows which way we're going to go. But it's one worth watching and worth discussing, right? If we're talking every week at the end, and I will say this briefly coming up, to thank you for engaging in the cause of democracy on a Friday morning, as we do every Friday, 256 times. This should be part of that conversation of democracy. This is a slap in the face of the conversation of democracy, and we should be talking about it in that way. We should be talking to each other and to others about what this suggests, about what this means, about what this implies. Even the mere implication of it should be shocking. not just a distraction, and maybe it is just a distraction, but its presence and its use, that's a big deal, folks. It's a big deal, and we should treat it that way. Okay. Okay, so I'm 1 minute early. I'm gonna move my common sense things here. So I'm gonna reach very there. Okay. Mug. So for those of you who are here and haven't been here before, let me explain what's going to happen. We're about to go into questions. Yeah, thank you, Emma, the tour guide. It is not a distraction. I don't think it is either, but even if it was intended to be, shouldn't be. But normally what happens at this point is, and I've done this all without coffee, so I will say I'm very proud of myself. But for 256 weeks, I have a mug that in one way or another reflects on the theme that we're discussing. And at this point, I bring up the mug and show how it has something to do with what we're talking about. And I'm in Florida in a hotel room. I don't have a mug, but Linda said, don't they have like cardboard cups in the room? And yes, they do. Yes, they do.
How appropriate.
It's a crown.
No way. That is hilarious. How
It's
in the world did you mastermind that one?
it's a crown.
That is hilarious.
This is the most appropriate non-mug mug.
Wait, hang on. Hold that. Keep that held up. I got to take a picture of that one. That one is a keeper for all time. Oh my God. I got it. That's so funny.
Linda said this, and I was like, oh.
But usually they're just a plain white cup. The fact that it literally has a crown on it, I'm just
No.
like, ooh.
Yep, got a cardboard cup. Sure do.
Thank you, hotel saints up there.
So anyway, okay, so
That is really funny.
that worked nicely.
Yeah,
Okay,
it really
so
did.
now we will open things up for
All
questions.
right.
Open chat too, so I can see
All
what.
right. Well, because she sent you that really cool mug, I'm going to do Sydney's question first. Um,
And
so
explain
Sydney
who Sydney
asked,
is because we have so many people here who
oh,
are normally
yeah.
here.
So Sydney is a college student who has been with us, I think, since close to the beginning. And she's delightful because I got to actually meet her in Atlanta. So I can say that from personal experience. And she tunes in as many times as she can when her college schedule permits. And she's very active in our community. So Sydney asks, have other presidents in American history tried to establish themselves as monarch or dare I say dictator as what we're seeing now? What's different now versus in the past?
Well, one thing that's different now relates to what I just said, which is a president saying, "I am king." Like if you know American history, and you know, and I think probably even if we haven't spoken about it before, you have a sense that like a king bowing down to a king in the United States is not going to go over well. Right? We do not bow down to kings. You're not going to use that word. You're not going to use that language. Have there been presidents who have tried to um, capitalize in every sense of the word on executive power, have tried to promote the power of the executive? Yes, for sure. And, the story of American government, if you go back to the 19th century, Congress was the big deal when it came to the center of attention and to some degree the power of the government. Newspapers at the time, most of the column inches in newspapers at the time were focused on Congress, had full debates or condensed versions of full debates were in newspapers. People read them. They could tell you like, well, today in Congress, this was the discussion. Congress was where all of the attention was. It's over time that in American history and American government that the presidency has been strengthened and strengthened and strengthened and strengthened. So this is a long-standing issue, and we've had some presidents who've done that to an extreme degree, or who have considered themselves above the law to one degree or another. I wonder, be interesting. At some point, it'll be really interesting in future, down the road. Some historian needs to, let's say 50 years in the future, come to this moment and see how people are talking about Richard Nixon and write an essay or an article or a paper, senior essay, something about Richard Nixon and his reputation at this moment in time. If you're talking about presidents and power and exceptions to rules and the law. But at any rate, so yes, there have been presidents. I mean, to think about Andrew Jackson did not call himself a king, but he was called King Andrew by people who hated him because he was making these declarations about the amount of power he had or wanted. The Supreme Court made this ruling, let the Supreme Court enforce it. Maybe apocryphal, but still, Andrew Jackson very much was positioning himself and promoting himself and posing as a figure that had that kind of power in a way that a president had not claimed before. Now, the difference between that and now is that Andrew Jackson rose to power on his appeal. And by that, I mean that he was appealing routinely to the public as, like, man of the people, I'm the common man's president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he rode to power and remained in power with that kind of idea that he was going to be the man of power before the American people. He was the common man's president, but he was the man of power at the top. What he didn't necessarily do is say, and you know what, to hell with everything else, because the system doesn't matter. It's just that I'm king and I will now take everything apart, top to bottom. To some degree, even though he was stretching the bounds of the Constitution in some ways, he was not doing what we see happening in front of us right now. But he was called the origins of ultimately what became the Whig Party were just people. It was the We Hate Andrew Jackson Club. It was like people of all different kinds of politics coming together, and the thing they hated was the King Andrew crazy assertions that he was making and the claims that he was making and the sort of, populist way in which he was behaving. So the Whig Party started out as really, in a sense, the anti-Jackson party. And the anti-King sort of component of the American ethos was plugged in right there at the time. But the degree to which there is someone, a president, essentially saying, hey, I'm a king, like, love me, I'm the king. No. That's lucky us that we are in this moment watching this happen, she said sarcastically. But honestly, I do think that language betrays such a supreme ignorance of American history and the American ethos that it's stunning to see. I just, and we'll see, but in my mind, the anti-king knee-jerk reaction, we do not bow down to kings, is pretty strong. And if you had a vague sense, think of the degree to which people on the right, as well as sometimes on the left, but the degree to which people on the right harken back to American revolutionary rhetoric and images and flags and everything else for a revolution, like, the rights of the people. There's a deep connection with that, accurately or inaccurately. So to use that kind of language says a lot about what you are or are not aware of as far as what the American nation is and what the American people are and what the American people truly believe. Okay, that's one question. I'll stop because I'm going on. Oh,
Yeah.
I do want to say something, and I realize I'm getting in the way of the second question, but I saw the word probationary employee, the phrase go drifting by in chat. I just want to address that for a moment because I think there's a misunderstanding about what that means, because I was one at a time. So probationary employee doesn't mean you're not really employed by the government. When you are hired for a job, you are on probation for a period of time. No, and what that means is you don't have typical government protections. So I believe for a year, I worked at the Library of Congress, was hired at the Library of Congress. And for a year, I was on probation, meaning if I did something wrong, like, I could be out. So in a sense, I was a probationary employee. It didn't mean I wasn't hired. It didn't mean I wasn't an employee. It didn't mean that there wasn't a job that they needed someone for and that I was filling it. It just meant that it was easy to fire me for a year. That's what a probationary employee is. It's not an unreal employee. It's not someone that doesn't have a real job. So, when I've been saying recently, like, there were several hundred people from the FAA that were fired, and people keep saying, yeah, but they're just probationary employees. It's like, all that means is that they were in their first year. It doesn't mean they weren't real employees. It doesn't mean they didn't have real jobs. It just means they were slightly easier to fire. So I just wanted to make that point because I think that's a pretty common misunderstanding. And now I will shut up and open things up for questions.
No, teaching's the same way. We had 3 years probation where you had to demonstrate you were really, and they could get rid of you for any reason without even having to explain But once you got past that, then it was a little harder. Okay, so Gloria asks, how do you answer the people who say that she says he is purposely doing it? I'm assuming she means the president, is doing it to stir people up. It is ribbing his critics. Was not the anti-king rhetoric and the revolutionary propaganda to arouse anger?
Well,
Does
in
she
the
think
Revolutionary
just
era,
messing?
I'm sorry?
I think she means, is he just messing with the
Right.
the
Well,
press
I
and
don't think those things are mutually exclusive, though. Well, I'll come back to now, but for just a moment, I don't think the Revolutionary era was rousing anger for a purpose, right? So the point was get people upset so that they'll be willing to say, I'm going to step away from the king now. So you're right. The point was to get people riled up, but it was to get people riled up to take political action. So yeah, I mean, we know the sort of style, political style of President Trump, and he loves getting people riled up, and he loves getting people upset. Getting the liberals upset. Which is why I think some people are saying ignore this. It's a distraction. But even if it is, right, even if the point is just to get people focused on it and riled up and, whoa, and that's making people look at those, look at the libs getting all upset because he used the word king. Ha ha ha. The fact of the matter is, even if that is all it is, let's say all he wanted was to get people upset and get attention. And look, he got it. Regardless of that, he set something off in saying that at this moment when the United States government is being dismantled in front of our eyes, and thousands of people are being fired, and agencies are being absorbed or eliminated. And so, whether he just meant to throw it around and get people upset, that happening in this moment has a deep meaning and is a better way, is a way for us to focus better on this moment. So, in a sense, I'm not really thinking about whether he means it just to rile us up. The fact of the matter is that there's truth in the use of that word that is being reflected in what's going on politically right now. So, in that sense, distract away because it's also going to alert people and get people thinking about what's going on, in part because this anti-kingness of the American ethos that, we may claim we love or hate different things, and we have clearly very divided politics right now. But we do not bow down to kings. That's a pretty strong one. So if it's a distraction, okay, it's a distraction. But in this moment, that has a pretty deep meaning.
Yeah. Okay, we have Kathy Porter, another longtime member of the community, says, how can a theory of unitary executive power fit in our constitutions and with the feelings of the founders and framers?
Well, so the founders and framers, the Constitutional Convention was about power and structure, right? What the heck? We have to have a government, we have to give it power, then what? And how do we structure it so that it's controlled in some way? And obviously, one of the things that they were really worried about was the national executive, because the default was king, right? I mean, the American colonists, and then they declare independence, they become Americans. Their default was the king, the monarch. So getting them to think differently, to do something different. This is again common sense, Thomas Paine. This is a big deal. So at the convention, they're very wary about executive power, which is why saying anything about presidential immunity and the founders makes me want to pull every hair off of my head, right? It's like, no, like really no. That this was a group of people. There were people who were monarchists who would have felt comfortable with a more monarchical kind of king. But the fact of the matter is, the Constitutional Convention spent a lot of time thinking about the national executive. They were so worried about one person having too much power and America backsliding into a monarchy that they talked about having an executive council, a board of sorts. They were like, you know what? What if we don't have one president? What if we have three? And that way, there's not one guy that has that power. There are actually three, and it can be divided up in some way. Wouldn't that be safer than giving that much power to one person? That's how afraid they were of giving one person that much power. Now, ironically, I think about this all the time. I swear I do. I know you can believe me. You've been here long enough to know. They decided that wasn't a good idea because when you have a single executive, he alone will be responsible for what he does. When you have three men, one of them can do something horrible and then hide behind the other two, and it can be like he said, she said, I didn't do this, and you could mask crimes of various sorts if there were three. But if there's one president, whatever he does, he'll be responsible for, and fear and shame, fear of being found out, shame at being shown for what he really is, that would restrain a president from doing things really bad. Just imagine that. Shame will restrain the president. What a cute idea. But at any rate, that was the thought, was that one person, it's dangerous to give one man power of that sort. Should we or shouldn't we? We don't know. We're going to talk about it for a while, but maybe it's good because one person is accountable. There's that word. One person can be held accountable for what they do. And that matters. I've talked about that a few 100 million times here on History Matters, right? That one of the core tenets of our government is the idea of accountability. That people who are given political power are accountable to us for how they use that power. Accountability is a core part of a democratic government. And there's an example of that right there. When they were thinking about the presidency, we got to make sure that it's clear that the president is accountable to us. And if someone feels that they're accountable to no one, yeah, then they might well want to style themselves a king. And then you actually are moving very rapidly away from any kind of democratic government where it's the people who have the power, where it's the people who have the say, where public opinion governs. That's democratic governance.
The chat is on fire.
All I see is like
17 more questions that we are not going to get to. We're going to try a few more. All right. Tim Johnson, our buddy, asks, given our current situation, I'm curious about the relative silence from the former living presidents. Only Vice President Pence seems to be speaking out. Why are they being so silent? Is that an unspoken presidential tradition that once you leave office, you don't comment?
And I don't have wise words to say about that because I will say that to some extent, and I do think there's a long tradition that when you step down, you don't comment on what present presidents are doing when you're a past president. Um, and I, on the one hand, understand that logic. On the other hand, this is not a normal moment remotely. And so you really cannot say like, well, traditionally speaking, this is what we do. We're so far past that moment. We truly are. So I don't know what to say about that decision, and why it is or isn't being done. I see, it's actually, I see again online people yelling at Kamala, like, why isn't she saying something? It's like, really? Really?
Yeah.
She was here. She was ready to take it over. She ran a campaign, and now that you said no, and that she has a chance to like catch her breath from running a presidential campaign. Now you're like, hey, where are you? It's like, I, I just can't. But at any rate, the larger question as to where are the former presidents, I can't definitively say anything, but I do think some of the answer to that has to do with custom. As some of the answer to that probably has to do, again, with the implications of that, which would be past presidents kind of ganging up on the current president, which would then raise questions about, who has power and who doesn't. And despite the fact that we are in a moment right now where who has power and who doesn't is becoming increasingly clear. Congress not having much at the moment and not claiming much at the moment is its own separate question. But that's part of this moment too, which is the GOP and thus having the majority in Congress just kind of sitting back and watching it happen. And according to press this week, and I haven't gone and read it, so I can't report on this with any accuracy, but it sounds as though in private, there are Republican members of Congress begging Trump to not do some of what he's doing to their constituents. Right? Like, I'm going to support you. I'm going to support you, but just don't do it to my people. Okay. Just don't.
Right.
And, I said this in the last few days somewhere. I'm not going to remember where. When you support a king, you make yourself a beggar. And that's where we are right now. If you are a Republican who supported a king, you are now begging for things from that king. That is not our government. That is not three branches. That is not checks and balances. That is not the balance of power. That is not the way our government is supposed to work. Okay, I do want to say one thing because I did someone in they said it in chat and not in questions, and I know I'm supposed to only answer questions, but they said, "Can you address the absorption of the post office?" Yeah, I can. Really briefly, because I do want to get back to questions. But so here's the thing. That feels to me like a blatant grab at trying to get control of mail-in ballots and getting at elections. It's what it feels like to me. I speak from no authority other than that's what it feels like to me. Now, again, speaking as a historian, the postal system and the fact that in that late 18th century, it was so hard to connect the nation. Newspapers were a way of connecting the nation. Newspapers spread in the mail. So the US postal system is one of the first things that gets addressed when the new government is formed, because it's a thing that is understood. It will hold the nation together. It has a vital political, not partisan, political function in our government, in our nation at the time, with our government so spread out geographically and people not fully understanding how a country can work that's that spread out. The postal system was a big part of the answer. I recommend Richard John's book, Spreading the News. He is like the guy on the postal system. And this talks about this very question, the political importance, not partisan, but political importance of the postal system. It's not supposed to be a partisan weapon, right? And that it feels, again, I'm speaking more from my having glanced at a headline and listened to the news briefly, but it feels as though this is a blatant way of getting, again, at ballots, mail-in ballots, elections. We are watching this unfold, but that's my current guess as to what this is. And it's flies in the face of what the US postal system is supposed to do in our American system of government. It has a really important political purpose, and mail-in ballots are just a great example of that really important political purpose that the US postal system, an independent US postal system, serves.
All right. There were three other questions that were similar to ones you already answered, so I've whittled it down to 14. Okay, Bailey Paletti, who's been with us for quite some time, says people often talk about early Americans equating themselves with early Rome, abolishing the monarchy, establishing a republic, etc. American is a vague term here. How many and what kind of people have had casual familiarity with Roman history, or did the drive to independence cause people to read more early Roman history in a self-conscious attempt to copy and mimic it?
So this has been something that I'm always and have always been fascinated with, is the founding generation and their interest in a very present-minded political way, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. They, elite, educated people, let's put it that way, elite-ish educated people of the time were very well versed in ancient history. All of the pseudonyms that people used for their pamphlets and essays and newspaper writings, those pseudonyms were of ancient Greeks and Romans, and the assumption was anyone reading the name would know everything that that name stood for. So, these ancient Greek and Roman names were like shorthand for powerful messages, even in and of themselves. So people were inherently, not remotely, were very much absolutely familiar with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and the framers, in a very Enlightenment sense. So Enlightenment thinking is you look across all of time to find the broad patterns of nature and of man, and then based on those broad patterns, you can work for the present, right? That's a very bad, very simple understanding of the Enlightenment. But in that spirit, the framers said, okay, we're going to look through all of time Madison, there's a document of republics ancient and modern. Again, go to Founders Online through the National Archives, look it up. In preparing for the Constitutional Convention, James Madison looks at, you know, republics ancient and modern and looks at all of them over all time. And again, a lot of ancient ones. And what he's looking at is specifically what worked and what didn't, what went right, what went wrong, and thus what can we do, like the best of column A that has the good stuff and the least of column B, which is the bad stuff. So they thought about ancient Rome and ancient Greece constantly and in a very deliberate, pragmatic kind of a way. They were modeling themselves either against it or for it, but they considered ancient Greece and ancient Rome as a very present-minded example to help them style the new nation. It was why when I was in grad school, my minor, the minor field, like for my oral exam, I was examined on American history. I was examined on my specific topic, and my outside field that was not my topic was actually ancient Rome. Because ancient Rome, first of all, is again something that the framers were thinking about. Also, because I found it fascinating that ancient Rome gained an emperor, and there was a moment in ancient Roman history where people had to suddenly get used to the fact that there was like one guy that had that much power in a way that hadn't happened before. And that moment, how people responded to that moment, like, what do you do with an emperor? That felt very similar to me as to what Americans were doing when you suddenly had a president. Like, what does that mean when you have one person that has that much power? So that similarity mattered too. But that's a really good question because they thought about it all the time. They, and culturally, politically, and in every other way, they were constantly thinking about modeling, reading about ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
Yeah. I was just putting in the chat, what disturbs me about that is they're also pushing this classics only curriculum on schools. They want to do away with kids reading Toni Morrison or W.B. Du Bois or, any of the women, Fanny Fern, or, they want them to only read the Greek and Roman classics or, certain, like pretty much nothing after the 20th century. And
Yeah.
it feeds into this whole other, the book banning, the teacher bullying, the state standards revision, the dismantling of the Department of Ed. So it's a slippery slope.
It's a very slippery slope. And if you define classic as things written in an era before anyone other than white men would be worth reading, you got a problem.
That's exactly what we are seeing. So
yep, that's a problem.
A big problem. Okay. Thank you, Bailey. That was a great question. All right. Dave Ari, our good buddy, says, how do we grant power when we have a third of our eligible voters not even bothering to turn out to vote? And I had put the same thing in the chat. So I'd love to hear your answer to that question as well.
And I don't know how to answer that question. I would have thought if there were ever going to be a moment when everybody stood up and voted, it would be now. I really did. And numbers of people voting that's fluctuated throughout time. It just felt to me that I learned many things in the work and speaking and public work I was doing in leading up to the election. And no matter how much I sincerely believed and believe the degree of crisis that we're in, and I was speaking and writing and traveling and talking all the time about, democracy being at risk, I don't think that message resonated in the way that I thought it would. I thought that was the most obvious, powerful message. Like, come on, like democracy. But I think I said this in 2022. I think I reposted it recently on social media. I don't think people realize what they lose when they lose democracy. I said that in 2022. I don't think people really know what it is. I don't think they really know what the government does. And so, part of what's happening in this moment, people not voting, is that they don't know what they have. They don't know what they're losing. They don't, American exceptionalism, I've written and spoken a lot about this before too, the depth of the belief that it's always okay here because we're America and it's always been okay and it's us and it's fine and things that happen in other places, they don't happen here. that is such a powerful feeling. I think increasingly there are people who have moved beyond American exceptionalism, but even now, there are people who believe that, well, the worst is not going to happen here. It's not going to happen here because that's where exceptional, we're the United States of America. That's just not true. But it's just like kind of an inherent anti-kingness. There's an inherent exceptionalism belief too. And, inherent exceptionalism, that's not useful. And particularly right now, not only is it not useful, it's harmful. And I'm sure it helped people stay at home and think it's going to be okay. Why does my vote matter?
Yeah. All right. A lot of people in the chat and over here also in the Q&A are asking, where is Thomas Paine now and who is our modern day Thomas Paine?
Oh, wow. I don't know. Who would that be? Because it would have to be someone speaking to the people and not sounding pundity.
Mhm.
Some of you may have ideas. Heather.
Mm,
As maybe Heather. Well, except that that's not the purpose of what she's doing. She's informing. Paine was not just informing. Is it Raskin?
maybe.
Is it Jasmine Crockett? I don't know. I don't know the
Some
answer to
people
that.
said John Stewart might be Thomas Paine.
Whoever it is, I would say not Heather, because she's very explicitly not trying to be emotional. She's about, AOC. Maybe it's AOC,
Maybe.
actually. At any rate, Lawrence O'Donnell, look at all these people who might be it. I don't know. Lawrence O'Donnell, who I admire, but he might be still too pundity. You need someone who's like, I mean, AOC literally out in the street talking. So I don't know. Or
Yeah.
Jasmine,
Catherine suggested a songwriter that could rally us.
that would be
I would
nice.
say who's our Pete Seeger now. So that's just me.
Oh, I love Pete Seeger.
I do too.
Um,
All right.
someone just said, Bruce, that's for you.
I I I was going to say it, but I didn't want to look like I was, But thank you for saying it for me, Julia. Of course, that's who I thought of. All right, it's 11:01. Do you want to try one or two more?
Let's try one or two more. Oh God, Deb, we are waist deep in the big muddy.
Yeah.
Big fool says to move to push on. That's exactly where we are. If you don't know that song, go find that song. That's Pete Seeger.
Yep. Okay. James Dennis asked, Woodrow Wilson was very tyrannical as president. He seems to have been much worse than Jackson or others, from resegregating the government to bullying, locking up opponents, impressing Hitler with his propaganda. With Project 2025 and what's going on now with the current administration, he's curious if Wilson makes a better comparison for Trump.
Well, I would say a significant difference would be in the way that Wilson engaged with the public or didn't. I mean, unlike, a big part of Trump's appeal is the fact that um, his connection with his base in an emotional, unthinking kind of a way. That works in a democratic politics. And Wilson, it's a different time, it's a different model. So, and I think that's an important component. I don't think and by the way, Trump is good at rousing people's emotions and getting them on his side. I think that's important, an important part of the power that he has managed to garner.
Yeah. All right. A couple of people have asked, with all the talk about monarchies and kingship, would it be hereditary? Traditional monarchies, like in England, because someone had put in the chat earlier as well that he had made a joke in his last administration about his kids inheriting this after he left. And that was why he pulled them in to train them in that last administration. None of them are in this administration from what I've seen. So I'm just curious about that. In any event, the authoritarian vision is un-American. This was from Lawrence Schmidt.
Yes, the authoritarian vision is un-American, it's undemocratic. It is. Which is not to say, and this is important, that there haven't been authoritarian leaders, moments, actions. I don't want to say, and I don't think, again, we've been here long enough that you would know I'm not saying it's all been democratic sweetness and light until this moment, right? I mean, we've had any number of ways in which, just to name one thing, white supremacy has been enforced, has been perpetuated, right? People have been suppressed, have had their voting rights stripped away by policy, by law. I don't want to suggest that everything has been hunky dory and that now all of a sudden, wait, democracy is under threat. It has been, obviously, in many ways, many, many times for many kinds of people. What's happening now is that it's being spread, the entire system for everyone is being affected. And so we're experiencing this, particularly if we are not among the groups of people who routinely were suppressed and repressed before. We're seeing it and understanding the systematic implications of it in a different kind of a way than we have before, if we have not been victimized by it in the same way as other people have. Now, of course, now increasingly, we're not supposed to teach the history of that, right? We're not supposed to know as Americans that in the past, poll taxes, there are any number of ways in which Black Americans were victimized, repressed, suppressed, and that was a way that the government functioned. Oh, heaven forbid we learn about that. So, yeah. Um, I'm trying to catch up with, like, you can't catch up with the chat. I guess it's 6 minutes past. We probably should end it, right? So here's what I say. I'm gonna say, I say this every week. I used to not say this a long time ago when we began. I'd be like, maybe next week we'll talk about. Now I'm like, I don't know what the F I'm going to be talking about next week, because like at any given hour, there's some new thing. And I don't know, very often, sometimes I'll say we'll address questions next time. And then when I look at the questions, they're not that different, so that I don't end up addressing them. But I just don't know where we are, where we're going to be. And I'm guessing that questions about the nature of the presidency and monarchy are going to be relevant in a week. So this is not going to be the last time we discuss this. We might have, on Kings Part 2 on Friday. We have to I have to do like you, kind of day by day, move forward and see what screaming thing is calling to be addressed. But I know that there are people who need to go. So let me explain what happens next. Okay, so first off, we are going to move to the after party. So if you are here and you have been watching us through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. And the after party is, how can I not poof?
We love poof. Like, people wait for poof every week.
They wait for the poof.
It makes me happy just to do that.
I did say what the F, Linda, I'm sorry. But at any rate, I know I try so hard.
In
The after party, we do not record it so that we could be even freer and easier in our conversation and talk about like whatever the heck it is we want to talk about. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. Before we go to the after party, I do want to say, I want to thank everyone who is here on a Friday morning for engaging in the conversation of democracy as we have, for being here, for not always agreeing, for being able to disagree, but for being here week after week, 256 times, to talk about where we are, to ask questions, to talk amongst ourselves, to then take these kinds of conversations and go on and talk with others. It doesn't get more important than this now, right? Community matters now, engagement matters now, and what we are doing here every week, meeting and talking and hashing things through and hashing things through. I haven't had coffee. Hashing things through and figuring things out, that matters profoundly right now. So thank you for being here and engaging in that. And thank you to my wonderful partner in crime, Annie, and thank you to the NCHE, and thank you to Claire Avocado, And thank you to Jessica, and thank you to John, and most important of all, thank you to all of you folks who are here week after week, because this is a community of a sort that we all need them, and we need more of them. And so all by itself, that's an amazing thing that we do here week after week. Okay.